When people think of Judy Garland, they picture the girl skipping down the yellow brick road in The Wizard of Oz. What they don't picture is the emotional toll filming may have taken behind the scenes. According to later claims from those close to Garland, there was one part of production that left scars far beyond the movie set itself. And while Garland often hid the pain behind humor and charm, there were moments where the mask seemed to slip, revealing something much more unsettling underneath: the making of a tragedy. Whether she realized it or not, Judy Garland's life was mapped out for her almost from the moment she was born. Her parents were vaudeville performers, deeply rooted in the world of entertainment, so when she entered the world on June 10, 1922, the stage was already waiting. For the little girl who would one day become a Hollywood legend, performing was never a question of if, it was simply a matter of time. But back then, there was no Judy Garland. She was born Frances Ethel Gumm, a shy little girl with a name that hardly sounded destined for movie marquees and screaming fans. Nothing about Frances Gumm hinted at the glamour, heartbreak, and tragedy that would eventually define her life. Long before the bright lights of Hollywood, Frances was already performing. At just 2 years old, she began appearing on stage at her father's movie theater alongside her older sisters, Mary Jane and Virginia. Together, they became known as the Gumm Sisters, while their mother accompanied them on piano. From the outside, it looked like a charming childhood filled with music, applause, and family togetherness. But behind the curtain, trouble was already brewing. By 1926, shocking rumors surrounding Frances's father had begun spreading through their community. Allegations involving young boys created a scandal so damaging that the family fled to Lancaster in hopes of escaping the whispers. The move may have changed their address, but it did nothing to repair the emotional damage inside the home. As her parents' marriage slowly unraveled, Frances found herself increasingly under the control of her mother, Ethel. Determined to turn her daughters into stars at any cost, Ethel became relentless, shaping every detail of Frances's life and career. Years later, Judy would bitterly describe her mother as the real wicked witch of the West. It was Ethel who first introduced Frances to drugs while she was still just a child. To keep her energized for performances, she was given amphetamines in the morning. At night, sleeping pills were used to force her body to rest. It became a horrifying cycle that would follow Judy Garland for the rest of her life, planting the seeds for the addictions and health struggles that later consumed her. Meanwhile, the Gumm Sisters continued performing across the country, though their name quickly became a problem. According to Hollywood legend, one theater accidentally advertised them as the Glum Sisters, a mistake that perfectly captured how awkward and unmarketable the name sounded. By 1935, the trio adopted a more glamorous identity, the Garland Sisters. Not long after, Frances reinvented herself once again. Inspired by a Hoagie Carmichael song, she chose a new first name, Judy. And with that, Judy Garland was born. That new name would soon change everything. During a performance at Chicago's Orpheum Theater, songwriter Burton Lane sat in the audience watching the Garland Sisters perform. He had been sent by MGM boss Louis B. Mayer to scout fresh talent, but it didn't take long for one performer to completely capture his attention. Judy's voice was unlike anything he expected from such a young girl. Powerful, emotional, and mature, far beyond her years, it immediately stood out. Lane returned to Mayer with glowing praise, and within days, Judy was auditioning for Metro-Goldwyn-Mayer. When she sang for the executives, the room reportedly fell silent. Her audition was so impressive that MGM signed her immediately, skipping the traditional screen test entirely. The studio believed they had discovered something special, but even as they celebrated finding their newest star, they also saw her as a problem to be fixed. At 13 years old, Judy didn't fit Hollywood's ideal image. She was too old to be marketed as a child star, yet too young to become a glamorous leading lady. Standing only 4'11", she was petite, insecure, and constantly compared to the polished beauties surrounding her. The studio's treatment only deepened those insecurities. Louis B. Mayer cruelly referred to her as his little hunchback. At MGM school, Judy found herself surrounded by future icons like Ava Gardner and Elizabeth Taylor, Women celebrated for their beauty in ways Judy never felt she could compete with. Executives even altered her appearance physically, placing caps on her teeth and using rubber prosthetics on her nose in an attempt to make her more camera-friendly. Despite becoming one of MGM's biggest stars, Judy was constantly made to feel like she wasn't enough. Director Charles Walters later recalled that the studio treated her like the ugly duckling of the lot, even while she was making them millions. Judy was dressed in childish outfits and repeatedly boxed into girl next door roles, while more glamorous actresses were elevated as Hollywood royalty. And just as her career was beginning, tragedy struck at home. Right before one of her earliest professional radio performances, Judy learned that her father had been hospitalized with meningitis. In a heartbreaking twist, he listened to her sing over the radio from his hospital bed while dying. He passed away the very next morning. Judy barely had time to grieve. Hollywood kept moving, and so did she. At MGM, another challenge soon emerged in the form of Deanna Durbin, a young blonde opera singer who became Judy's biggest rival. The studio essentially placed the two teenagers in direct competition, unsure which one deserved long-term investment. To settle the debate, MGM cast them together in the musical short Every Sunday, creating what amounted to a public talent test. But when audiences saw Judy on screen, something about her simply connected. She had a raw, emotional quality that couldn't be manufactured. MGM made their decision, and Deanna eventually left the studio. By 14, Judy had her true breakout moment at Clark Gable's birthday party. Her performance of You Made Me Love You completely captivated the crowd, earning her thunderous applause and even a kiss from the Hollywood superstar himself. Louis B. Mayer was ecstatic. After the performance, he reportedly pulled Judy onto his lap in celebration, a moment that would later take on a far darker meaning considering the accusations Judy would eventually make against him. As Judy's fame exploded, so did the pressure surrounding her. In 1937, she was paired with Mickey Rooney in a string of wildly successful musicals. Audiences loved their chemistry, but for Judy, the relationship was painful. She developed genuine feelings for Rooney while he saw her only as a friend. On screen, she constantly played the girl hopelessly chasing after him. Off-screen, reality was painfully similar, but heartbreak was only part of the nightmare. Behind MGM's glamorous image existed what Judy later described as a full-blown pill culture. To survive the brutal filming schedules, young actors were routinely given amphetamines to stay awake and barbiturates to sleep. Judy's dependence deepened as the years passed, trapping her in the same destructive cycle her mother had introduced during childhood. The studio also became obsessed with controlling her weight. Executives repeatedly told Judy she was too heavy, despite the fact that she was often dangerously thin. Meals were monitored constantly. On one occasion, when Judy ordered a regular meal, it was reportedly replaced with only soup and lettuce. No amount of fame could erase the insecurity that treatment created. Then came the darkest revelations of all. According to Judy's unfinished autobiography, powerful men throughout Hollywood regularly propositioned her as she grew older. The most disturbing accusations centered around Louis B. Mayer himself. Judy claimed that Mayer would touch her inappropriately under the guise of helping her sing with emotion, using humiliating excuses to justify the behavior. For years, she endured it in silence because that was the culture of Hollywood at the time. Young actresses were expected to tolerate abuse if they wanted to survive. But eventually, Judy Garland reached her limit. One day, after Mayer crossed the line once again, she finally stood up to him. Looking directly at one of the most powerful men in Hollywood, she warned him never to touch her that way again. Mayer was reportedly stunned. In his mind, he believed his behavior was acceptable because he claimed to love her, but Judy no longer cared about his excuses. The heartbreaking reality was that Mayer was not an exception. He was simply part of a much larger system that treated young stars like products instead of people. And for Judy Garland, the deeper she fell into fame, the darker that system became. How Hollywood destroyed Judy Garland. Back in 1938, Judy Garland landed what would become the defining role of her career, Dorothy Gale, in The Wizard of Oz. But surprisingly, she was never the studio's first choice. MGM boss Louis B. Mayer originally tried to bring in Shirley Temple for the part. When that fell apart, The role was then offered to Deanna Durbin. Only after both options disappeared did the producers finally convince Mayer to cast Garland. In hindsight, it's impossible to imagine anyone else walking down the yellow brick road. Her performance became the emotional heartbeat of the film and turned her into one of Hollywood's brightest young stars. By 1939, Garland seemed unstoppable. She won her first, and ultimately only, Academy Award for her performances in The Wizard of Oz and Babes in Arms, cementing her place as MGM's Golden Girl. But as the 1940s began, the studio started pushing her into more mature roles, and with that shift came pressures she had never faced before. Until then, Garland had mostly played innocent, youthful characters. Romance was territory she barely knew, both on-screen and off. That changed with Little Nellie Kelly, a production that challenged her in every possible way. She had to master an accent, perform an emotional death scene, and film her very first on-screen kiss. The experience was anything but comforting. Her co-star George Murphy later mocked her awkwardness during their romantic scenes, cruelly comparing the moment to a hillbilly with a child bride. For Garland, the humiliation lingered, but in many ways, that uncomfortable experience was only a preview of the emotional heartbreak waiting for her in real life. Still a teenager, Garland fell deeply in love with bandleader Artie Shaw. To her, it felt like her first true adult romance. She threw herself into the relationship completely, only to have it end in devastating fashion. In early 1940, Shaw abruptly left her behind and eloped with Lana Turner instead. Garland was crushed. Not long afterward, another musician entered her life, David Rose. There was one major complication: he was still married. Even so, Rose proposed to Garland the moment she turned 18. When MGM executives discovered the situation, they stepped in immediately and blocked the marriage until his divorce became official. Forced to wait, Garland drifted into another passionate affair, this time with songwriter Johnny Mercer. Like the men before him, Mercer was older and married, which made the relationship explosive, even by Hollywood standards. Though the affair was brief, Mercer fell intensely in love with Garland and poured those emotions into the song I Remember You, essentially turning it into a musical love letter. Hollywood gossip spread quickly. Friends warned both of them that the relationship was doomed, pointing to their age gap and the scandal surrounding the affair. Mercer's wife, Ginger, became so frustrated that she reportedly banned Garland's name, and even the song itself, from being mentioned inside their home. Yet despite the turmoil, Mercer and Garland kept finding their way back to each other long after the relationship was supposedly over. Eventually, Garland prepared to marry David Rose once his divorce was finalized, but MGM remained furious about the union. The tension exploded in 1941 when Garland discovered she was pregnant. The studio feared motherhood would destroy the carefully crafted image they had built around her innocent, youthful persona. Executives worried audiences would no longer see her as the wholesome girl next door. Under enormous pressure from both the studio and her own mother, Garland was pushed into having an abortion. Tragically, it would not be the last time. In 1943, during an affair with Tyrone Power, Garland became pregnant again. Once more, the studio intervened and refused to allow her to keep the child. The emotional damage from that level of control was enormous. It seeped into every corner of her life, including her marriage to David Rose. Though they shared a love of music, their personalities could not have been more different. Garland was energetic, social, and impulsive. Rose, 12 years older, preferred a far quieter life. But the deepest wound came from Rose's involvement in encouraging her first abortion. Garland never fully recovered from that betrayal, and by 1944, the marriage had collapsed completely. Ironically, it was during this painful chapter that her career reached an entirely new level. That same year, Garland starred in Meet Me in St. Louis, a movie that transformed both her image and her confidence. For one of the first times, MGM presented her not as a childlike figure, but as a genuine leading lady. Much of that transformation came from legendary makeup artist Dorothy Ponadel. Garland had spent years wearing uncomfortable nose discs and dental caps designed to improve her appearance. Ponadel immediately told her to get rid of them. Instead of hiding Garland's features, Ponadel refined them subtly, reshaping her eyebrows, adjusting her hairline, and softening her overall look. More importantly, she convinced Garland that she was already beautiful without all the artificial tricks the studio had forced onto her for years. The change was life-altering. For the first time, Garland truly felt attractive and worthy of being seen as glamorous. She became so loyal to Ponadell that she later demanded the makeup artist be included in all of her future MGM productions. That newfound confidence radiated through every frame of Meet Me in St. Louis. Audiences could feel it. Garland wasn't simply performing anymore. She seemed to glow. One scene in particular became unforgettable. Her haunting performance of Have Yourself a Merry Little Christmas. Sitting in that elegant red dress and pearls, Garland delivered the song with such vulnerability that audiences felt instantly connected to her. It became one of the defining moments of her entire career. Off-screen, her personal life was becoming just as dramatic. During this period, two powerful men were pursuing her attention. One was Orson Welles, who was still married to Rita Hayworth at the time. Garland and Welles carried on an affair that stretched into 1945 before quietly ending on surprisingly good terms. The other man was her director, Vincente Minnelli. Minnelli had recognized Garland's untapped potential from the beginning and worked closely with Dorothy Ponadell to reshape her screen image. Though the two initially clashed during filming, their tension eventually turned into romance. On June 15, 1945, Garland and Minnelli married. A year later, they welcomed their daughter, Liza Minnelli, into the world. Unlike her previous pregnancies, MGM surprisingly allowed Garland to keep the baby. From the outside, life appeared perfect. But behind closed doors, Garland's mental health was deteriorating rapidly. During the filming of The Pirate, years of self-medication and emotional exhaustion finally caught up with her. Her anxiety spiraled into a full nervous breakdown. Garland was sent to a private sanitarium for treatment before eventually returning to complete the movie. The delays sent production costs soaring, and when the film failed at the box office, MGM blamed Garland's instability as much as the movie itself. Only months later, matters became even darker. In July 1948, Garland attempted suicide for the first time, injuring herself with broken glass. Though the wounds were not fatal, the incident revealed just how fragile her emotional state had become. Even amid the chaos, Garland somehow managed another comeback. Easter Parade became the biggest financial success of her career, leading MGM to reunite her with Fred Astaire for the Barclays of Broadway. But behind the scenes, Garland's dependency on pills and alcohol was worsening. She began taking dangerous substances containing morphine while also battling migraines and severe exhaustion. Her attendance on set became unpredictable, and eventually MGM suspended her production schedule altogether, replacing her with Ginger Rogers. After a short break, Garland returned to star in the Good Old Summertime, another box office success. Yet the cycle had become painfully familiar: public triumph followed by private collapse. Things reached a breaking point during production of Annie Get Your Gun. Garland clashed constantly with director Busby Berkeley, who openly criticized her behavior and accused her of draining the production's energy. At the same time, Garland's depression deepened. She underwent electroshock therapy in an attempt to stabilize her mental health, but nothing seemed to ease her struggles. Her lateness became chronic. Then came the missed shooting days entirely. Desperate and emotionally exhausted, Garland pleaded directly with Louis B. Mayer to remove Berkeley from the production. Instead, the situation only worsened. Eventually, MGM fired her from the film altogether. With her career collapsing around her, Garland entered a Boston hospital where doctors finally focused seriously on treating her addiction. For the first time in years, she was slowly weaned off the pills that had dominated her life. During her recovery, Garland found unexpected comfort in spending time with disabled children at the hospital. Their warmth and innocence helped pull her attention away from her own suffering. Later, she admitted the experience gave her a sense of peace she desperately needed. By the time she returned to Los Angeles, Garland looked healthier and happier than she had in years. But MGM cared less about her recovery than her appearance. Executives immediately pressured her to lose weight again, and before long, she returned to the same pills she had fought so hard to escape. Summer Stock became Garland's final film for MGM. Despite performing well financially, her unpredictable behavior during production reportedly cost the studio thousands of dollars. Executives began questioning whether keeping her employed was worth the constant turmoil. Then came one final disaster. After losing her role in Royal Wedding, Garland spiraled into despair and attempted suicide once again. Though her injuries were relatively minor, newspapers sensationalized the story across headlines nationwide. Looking back later, Garland admitted she felt trapped between confusion, fear, and emotional exhaustion. She no longer saw a future ahead of her. By September 1950, MGM officially severed ties with the woman they had raised into stardom over 15 years. And 1 year later, her marriage to Vincente Minnelli collapsed as well. The strain of Garland's mental health struggles had deeply damaged the relationship, though Hollywood rumors suggested other tensions existed too. Speculation surrounding Minnelli's sexuality followed the couple for years, adding even more pressure to an already fragile marriage. Suddenly, Garland found herself abandoned by the studio system that had once built her career. Money became tight, and she desperately needed a path back into the spotlight. That lifeline arrived through Bing Crosby. Seeing Garland at her lowest point, Crosby invited her to appear on his radio show. Even with the opportunity in front of her, Garland was terrified. She worried audiences would no longer see her as a performer, but as a tragic figure marked by scandal and emotional breakdowns. On the night of the broadcast, she nearly backed out completely, but Crosby sensed her panic and stepped in with remarkable compassion, introducing her to the audience with warmth and encouragement that instantly changed the atmosphere. What followed became one of the greatest comebacks of her career. Garland's appearances on Crosby's program were enormously successful. Critics wrote that she seemed reborn in front of live audiences. Between 1950 and 1951, she appeared on the show 8 separate times, rebuilding both her confidence and her reputation. Leaving Hollywood behind, Garland returned to live performance, where she rediscovered the connection with audiences that had made her a star in the first place. In 1951, despite her personal struggles and ongoing divorce, she launched a major concert tour that reminded the world exactly who she was. Critics praised her performances with overwhelming enthusiasm. At the London Palladium, Garland told reporters she felt reborn. Audiences responded with thunderous ovations, unlike anything the venue's management claimed to have heard before. Then came her legendary performances at the Palace Theater, where critics described her return as one of the greatest personal triumphs in entertainment history. For the first time in years, it seemed like Judy Garland had truly found her way back, not just professionally, but emotionally too. And as her career soared once more, her personal life finally appeared to be moving toward brighter days. The final years of struggle. While still technically married to Vincente Minnelli, Judy Garland found herself swept into a passionate new relationship with businessman Sidney Luft. Luft entered her life at one of her darkest moments, when her career, health, and emotional state all seemed to be hanging by a thread. Years later, he described their connection as immediate and electric, almost as if he felt compelled to protect her from everything closing in around her. And in many ways, he did exactly that. Luft became far more than just her romantic partner. He stepped in as her producer, manager, and biggest supporter, helping rebuild Garland's stage career piece by piece. Under his guidance, her live performances exploded in popularity, reminding audiences that despite all the scandals and setbacks, Judy Garland still possessed a once-in-a-generation kind of magic. The partnership quickly evolved into marriage. In 1952, Garland and Luft tied the knot, and that same year they welcomed their daughter, Lorna Luft. But Luft believed Garland's comeback should not stop on the stage. He was convinced Hollywood had underestimated her, and he wanted to prove she could still dominate the silver screen. Together, they launched what they hoped would become the ultimate comeback project. A Star is Born with Warner Brothers. What looked promising on paper quickly became chaotic in reality. Garland and Luft desperately needed the film to succeed financially. They were counting on it not only as a career revival, but as a lifeline. Unfortunately, production quickly spiraled into trouble. As filming began, Garland slipped back into many of the destructive habits she had fought for years to escape. Delays piled up, shooting schedules collapsed, and tensions on set became unbearable. Executives at Warner Brothers were furious. Costs ballooned higher and higher, and the atmosphere surrounding the production grew increasingly strained. Still, when the film finally premiered, it seemed for a brief moment that all the suffering had been worth it. Critics were stunned by Garland's performance. Audiences embraced her return with overwhelming enthusiasm. Theaters filled up, reviews glowed, and the buzz surrounding the film felt enormous. But behind the applause was one brutal reality. The movie had become so expensive to produce that even strong box office numbers were not enough to make back the money. Financially, the comeback failed. Artistically, though, Garland had delivered one of the greatest performances of her life. When award season arrived, most people in Hollywood believed Garland's Oscar victory was practically guaranteed. Her performance in A Star is Born was considered untouchable, but fate had other plans. By the night of the Academy Awards, Garland had just given birth and was confined to a hospital bed. The Academy was so certain she would win that television crews were stationed directly inside her hospital room, ready to capture her emotional acceptance speech live for the world to see. Everything was prepared. The cameras were rolling. Garland waited nervously in bed while reporters and crew members stood by expecting history to unfold. Then came the shock. When the envelope was opened, the winner announced was Grace Kelly. The atmosphere inside Garland's hospital room reportedly collapsed instantly. Instead of broadcasting a triumphant moment, the camera crews quietly packed up their equipment and slipped away, leaving behind only silence and heartbreak. Public reaction was immediate. Many people believed Garland had been robbed of the award. Even Groucho Marx famously reached out afterward, calling the loss the biggest robbery since Brink's. As the years passed, the emotional and physical toll of Garland's life became harder and harder to hide. By 1959, her health had deteriorated badly. Years of exhaustion, stress, addiction, and relentless pressure finally caught up with her when she was diagnosed with acute hepatitis. She spent weeks hospitalized while doctors monitored severe damage to her liver. When she was eventually discharged, the prognosis was devastating. Doctors warned Garland she likely had only a few years left to live. Even worse, they believed she would never properly perform again. Oddly enough, Garland's reaction surprised everyone around her. Instead of panic, she reportedly felt relief. For the first time in her life, she no longer felt chained to the impossible pressure of constantly being Judy Garland. The expectations that had followed her since childhood suddenly seemed to lift from her shoulders. But Garland was nothing if not resilient. Despite the grim predictions, she kept fighting. Unfortunately, while her health was declining, her finances were collapsing too. Garland had fallen dangerously behind on her taxes, owing the IRS hundreds of thousands of dollars. Debt collectors were circling constantly, and the financial pressure became almost as overwhelming as her health problems. Still, she continued working. During production of The Judy Garland Show, Garland found comfort in a brief romance with Glenn Ford. Their relationship lasted only about 6 months, but many people close to Garland later described it as one of the healthiest romances she ever experienced. Ford often attended her tapings, quietly sitting in the audience and supporting her from the sidelines. For Garland, that attention and stability meant a great deal. But Ford's reputation as a notorious womanizer eventually created distance between them. Once Garland began wanting something more serious, he backed away from the relationship entirely. Once again, she found herself abandoned emotionally, just as her personal life was falling apart around her. By 1963, her marriage to Sidney Luft had completely unraveled. Their relationship had become a cycle of arguments, separations, and reconciliations for years. But this time, Garland finally reached her limit. When she filed for divorce, the allegations she brought forward were explosive. Garland accused Luft of physical abuse, drunken violence, and attempts to take her children away from her. She also cited severe mental cruelty throughout the marriage. The breakup was not just personal, it was professional too. Luft had managed much of Garland's career during their years together, and severing ties with him left her feeling increasingly isolated. At the same time, her career was beginning to slip again. After The Judy Garland Show was canceled, Garland returned to performing live on stage. But by 1964, audiences were beginning to witness a heartbreaking decline. During a run at Talk of the Town in London, Garland reportedly arrived late to performances and often appeared intoxicated. One night, while attempting to sing Over the Rainbow, she struggled to finish the performance. The audience turned on her brutally. Some reportedly booed. Others hurled dinner rolls toward the stage. Garland endured the humiliation as long as she could before finally fleeing backstage in tears. Later, she described the crowd as cruel and vicious, but the damage had already been done. The reviews that followed were merciless. For many fans, watching Garland during this period felt deeply tragic, like witnessing an extraordinary light slowly fading in real time. After separating from Luft professionally, Garland hoped for a fresh start with new agents, Freddie Fields and David Begelman. On the surface, it looked promising. Behind the scenes, however, the arrangement became disastrous. The two men were later accused of exploiting Garland financially, draining what little stability she still had left. By the time she finally broke away from them, the financial damage was catastrophic. By 1966, Garland's debt to the IRS had reportedly reached around $500,000. Desperate for cash, she sold her home at a major loss simply to stay afloat. Yet, even after major performances, she often saw little to none of the money she earned. In 1967, after completing a successful engagement at the Palace Theater, tax agents reportedly seized nearly all of her earnings almost immediately. At the same time, her personal life remained chaotic. While still legally tied to Sidney Luft, Garland began a relationship with tour promoter Mark Herron. Once her divorce was finalized, the two married in Las Vegas in 1965. The marriage collapsed within only 5 months. Their breakup turned ugly fast. Garland accused Herron of abuse, while Herron claimed he had acted only in self-defense. It was another painful chapter in a lifetime filled with failed romances and emotional disappointments. Yet somehow, Garland never completely gave up on the hope of finding love. Then came one of the strangest encounters of her life. In 1966, Garland met Mickey Deans at a hotel in New York City under bizarre circumstances. A mutual acquaintance had sent Deans to deliver amphetamines to Garland, but when he arrived and noticed her children nearby, he quickly pretended to be a doctor to avoid suspicion. Over time, the two developed an unstable on-and-off relationship that lasted several years. By 1969, Deans proposed marriage, hoping they could begin a new chapter together. Tragically, neither of them realized how little time Garland had left. Toward the end of her life, Deans tried desperately to revive her fading career, arranging appearances and promoting her relentlessly. But Garland's addiction struggles overshadowed everything else. Then, on the morning of June 22, 1969, Deans made a devastating discovery inside the bathroom of their rented London home. Judy Garland was dead. She was only 47 years old. Judy Garland exposes the Wizard of Oz, scene that broke her. Everyone remembers that iconic image from 1939, the Wizard of Oz following the yellow brick road with Toto beside her and the cheerful Munchkins singing all around her. On screen, it looked like pure fantasy, the kind of Hollywood magic that could make audiences forget the real world for a couple of hours. But behind the bright colors and catchy songs, the atmosphere on set was far darker than most people ever realized. According to a memoir written years later by Judy Garland's former husband, Sid Luft, the teenage star spent much of the production dealing with constant harassment from some of the actors playing the Munchkins. Luft claimed the men would grope and torment her during filming, believing they could get away with it because of their size and because nobody around them seemed willing to take the behavior seriously. What makes the allegations even more disturbing is the fact that many of the actors involved were reportedly middle-aged men, while Garland herself was still just a teenager trying to survive the pressures of a massive Hollywood production. And according to Luft, the adults overseeing the set largely brushed it aside as harmless joking. Instead of protecting the young actress, they reportedly dismissed the incidents as backstage antics. His memoir later connected those traumatic experiences to the emotional struggles Garland battled throughout her life, including addiction and severe mental health issues that followed her long after filming ended. What makes the story even more heartbreaking is how Garland seemed unable, or perhaps unwilling, to openly discuss what happened. Years later, during an interview with Jack Parr, she laughed off questions about the Munchkins and turned the conversation into a performance. She joked about them always being drunk and needing to be rounded up with a butterfly net. At one point, she even mentioned one of the older actors asking her out to dinner. But underneath the laughter, there were brief moments where it seemed like something much heavier was trying to surface before she quickly slipped back into her polished showbiz persona. For many viewers looking back now, it feels less like comedy and more like someone desperately trying to hide pain behind a smile.